Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrew Smith. I'm an associate professor in the School of Library and Information Management at Emporia State University. And my colleague is Emily Vardell.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Vardell. I am an assistant professor in the School of Library and Information Management, also at Emporia State University. Thank you so much for coming to our session.
Thanks. And Emily, if you could move me on to the next slide, please. We are here to talk basically about what led us to create an OER resource, how we identified the resources we wanted to include, how we created evaluation questions we used, including getting student input, how we navigated the difficulties independently and at the institutional level, and how we've continued to support this work at the institution. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. So I've been in some absolutely fascinating sessions so far that have been exceptionally detailed and huge, and we're not exceptionally huge. So I think we're a little bit of an antidote for those of you who are feeling a little bit overwhelmed. So what led us to create an OER resource in the first place? And the first thing is, obviously, we're library scientists, and we are passionately believing in free and open and equal access to information. So for us, it's not just a bandwagon that we are seeing coming down. This is who we are professionally. It's what we do. So when we are being encouraged to do this, we are moving right ahead. OER is now a platform in the university's strategic plan that was revamped in 2018 to include OER. The SLIM P&T policy, and this has come up in a couple of questions in sessions I've been in, now includes mention of OER as well as mention of open access publishing. And before anyone takes fright, that doesn't mean no peer review publishing. It means peer-reviewed publishing, but that is open, that is equitable of access, rather than constantly behind a paywall. So that's now actually in our P&T policy. There is a slight premium awarded to publications that are open in access, and then the encouragement for open educational resources. We sort of started out in this because we were the pilot collaboration with the William Allen White Library, which is our on-campus library, in their desire to start experimenting with unlimited use ebooks. And all of you are probably familiar with the understanding that libraries of all sorts have traditionally not wanted to purchase textbooks simply because you can't provide equitable access to a paper copy unless you have one copy on reserve with a very short-term checkout. So as the landscape changed and they were seeing more and more things becoming available as unlimited use ebooks, we were approached and asked if we would like to collaborate. Actually, part of the reason that we ended up doing this was the university published an ebook collection that included 2 or 3 books that we were using as textbooks. So rather than setting out to find textbooks, we were identifying books we were using as textbooks in there. So we started out with that idea that we would be partnering with the library to experiment and see what was going on. The next level of that was actually the library soliciting suggestions as to books that we might use. And a book that we commonly use in the research course was available as an unlimited use ebook. It was required, and so we asked the library to get that. At that time, there was still another book required, but pretty much was only available as print. There was a Kindle version available, but it's Kindle that is not necessarily a particularly friendly format for multiple formats of e-resources. And also it was only available with an individual license. And we agreed between us, Dr. Vardell and I, that we did not want the university trying to buy something with an individual license if every student is trying to read it at the same time. And in the semester that we were starting out to do this project, which was funded by a Craig grant through Emporia State, and those have already been mentioned a couple of times, we were both teaching. I was teaching 2 sections. Emily, were you teaching 1 or 2?
2. Mm-hmm.
2. So we had 4 sections of this course, which was the majority of sections in that 1 semester. And so we thought we had a lot of opportunity to work with this and make it meaningful. And the book that we set out to replace, although it was in a library science course, that book itself was in fact generic. And so we thought we ought to be able to replace that fairly well. So if you pop to the next slide, Emily, I'll just say, so here are the 2 required texts for this course. The one on the left was that now available as an unlimited use ebook. The one on the right had to be bought in print. And in fact, the one on the right was more expensive, as I recall, than the one on the left. It was about a $70 book. And then we focused, I think there's a slide out of order here. I'm sorry, Emily. 2 solutions. So we did provide this one through the library. And then this second one was where we were planning to create the OER resource to replace the $70 book for our students. And I think I have 1 more slide to go. So both of us had previously taught the course. We were familiar with it. And what we were looking at was we defined broad categories of modules within the course. We were looked to identify suitable materials from previous versions of the course. We looked for gaps in that coverage, and then we searched for materials to fill those gaps, looking at open access materials, looking at university subscription databases, and then general web-based materials. Emily.
All right. So again, hopefully our 2 examples, one kind of supplementing or offering the replacement of the e-textbook, provides you 1 example. And then our other example we're going to talk about with that collating a bunch of materials to replace the workbook, kind of show you 2 different approaches. One pretty easy, the other one requires a little bit of work, but both hopefully are ones that you could see maybe implementing in your own classroom or for your own needs. So of course, we wanted to see, what do students think about this? So after we created the resources and implemented them in 1 semester, we wanted to find out from the students, what did they think about what we did? And I'm going to kind of integrate both the feedback and then show you examples of what this looked like in practice together. So you'll see some examples of what we're talking about when we talk about the resource that we created here in a couple of slides. So we just used a quick, easy, simple Google form to evaluate the use of the materials. We, again, made it quick and simple, so we would get the maximum number of responses. We had 5 fixed response items and then 2 free response questions. And there was a mix in how we implemented the survey. In one class, it was during class, during a synchronous session, and then another set of responses came from a course announcement, and we received 38 responses, which was a pretty good response rate for the classes that we had. So 1, as Andrew was mentioning, we offered the option of the ebook access through the library to this textbook, and we wanted to know, did they use it? Because it wasn't required. They didn't have to use the ebook. They could purchase the print book. And in a few other sessions I've been in, people have mentioned sometimes people like having the access of the print, having the physical copy. So that was always, of course, an option for students. And as you can see on the right side of this slide, the vast majority decided to use the ebook version through the library system. So almost 82%, that's that red piece of the pie there. The vast majority, again, deciding to go with the free to them option to access the ebook through our library. The next biggest portion was that 10.5%, the blue piece of the pie, which was purchasing or obtaining a print copy of the textbook. So we think this is pretty interesting. We've been following this for a few years now, seeing how are students accessing the textbook. Are they okay with the ebook version? Do they prefer the print? And so this might be relevant in your situation as well. So we're talking about graduate level students, oftentimes a little bit have been out of school for a while. They're coming back to school. So you might assume they'd be more likely to want a print textbook. That might be what they're more familiar with. But in fact, you'll see with this population, the bigger percentage were accessing the ebook version. So it seems promising in terms of a potential solution or a potential option to offer students low cost / free affordable access to textbooks. We also asked them how they were using it, again, just to kind of see about the interface, making sure it was working well for the students. And here again, the vast majority here, the blue piece of the pie, 91%, were accessing it via their laptop. So that seemed to be the most common way that people were accessing the ebook. Fewer were through a phone, desktop, and then someone offered a little more details. But it seemed like most people were using it through a laptop rather than through a Kindle or their phone or something like that. So that again was good to know in terms of how people were accessing ebooks. Now, again, as we were mentioning, the other solution that we looked at was creating this OER resource, and we created it through Canvas. So Canvas is the learning management system that our university uses. And so it was, again, freely available to us and easy to implement for students. So what we did is created this shell. And I'm showing you the top of the shell here that Andrew and I both had access to. And then what was really nice about having that in the Canvas shell is that we could take those materials and easily drop them into our 810 classes, and then add other instructors who are teaching 810 to the Canvas and allow them to just easily drop materials into their course. So it wasn't that we were asking students, go and access this separate other Canvas site. No, the OER materials were directly integrated in their own class. So our guess was that most of them didn't even know that they were accessing an OER material, an OER resource. They just saw free resources and liked that they didn't have to buy the book. And so that was very positive. But you'll see in the right side of the screenshot here, it's a mix of different things. So sometimes it might be an article or a worksheet, workbook kind of questions. Sometimes it might be tools. So we also looked, a lot of universities might have research centers, so they might have tips and tricks that they're promoting to their users, and then also discussion board prompts. So this is another screenshot. This one is probably even better at showing you the vast variety of resources that we pulled together in our OER resource. So this quantitative research one, again, it includes something from like a worksheet, an open access journal article, even some slides that we created together that we could include. And then the last two are these discussion boards that include questions that I'm going to talk about here in the next couple of slides, these kind of question sets. So we also asked them, how did they like this part? So the other pie charts I was showing you were about the e-textbook, the kind of main, what you might assume would look like a graduate textbook would look like. Well, what did they think about this collection of different resources from multiple places? So again, the vast majority here liked having the relevant material for each module in the corresponding module. So instead of saying, like I said, go to this separate resource or print out all these materials into its own workbook or something like that, it really was effective for us to create our resource in Canvas and then fully integrate it into the course shell, so that, again, it was very seamless for the students. Many of them probably didn't even know that that's what they were accessing. Although we tried to bring awareness to them so that they, again, as library science students, we wanted to say, okay, this is an OER resource, and here's what OER is about, and here's how libraries can support OER work. So as I mentioned, one of the resources that we integrated were these discussion board questions, that kind of sets of questions that we could use to help students assess whether they were understanding the material. And we were looking to replace that workbook type document. So that was that second book, the kind of blue-green cover that you saw in the previous slides. And it is very workbook focused. So it has questions to get people to assess articles and look at the strength of the research. And so what we wanted to do was create some replacement, not necessarily duplicate that, but create something that would be helpful for our students. So we wanted questions that could be used for those discussion board type assignments. So as is the case with many online classes, at the conclusion of a module, students have a discussion board where they need to respond to some prompts to demonstrate understanding and integration of the content. So we wanted to also, at the same time, invite students to engage with the content in a new way. So what we did is during a synchronous class session, we used Zoom breakout rooms and a Google Doc to have the students themselves provide the suggestions for the questions. So instead of Andrew and I coming up with a list of questions, we said, okay, how about the students? What do the students think they should get out of this material? If they wanted to assess whether they understood it well or not, what questions would they ask of themselves or ask of their peers? So I did this over 2 semesters. The first semester I did it before we created the OER resource. So the students kind of knew what they were looking to kind of mirror with that workbook. Although again, the questions are actually quite different than what the workbook has. And then I did it again in the second semester when they were already using the OER resource, again, to help them be part of the OER resource project. And then also get them to engage with the content in a different way. Because if you're thinking about what kind of questions would I need to think through to understand if I understand the content, it's a different way of thinking about things than just responding simply to the discussion board questions. So here's what that looked like in practice. Like I said, I used Zoom breakout rooms and had this Google Doc that basically looked like this and gave everybody the link, of course. And then I broke them up into groups, and each group was assigned a different aspect of research methods. And then I told them what are the sources of material from the textbooks that relate to that. So they could see, okay, they could go back, because oftentimes it was several weeks after we had talked about research questions, for example. So I wanted to help them figure out, okay, if you were going to assess whether you remembered or understood this content, what are some of the questions that you'd ask? So on this slide here, you can see some of the questions that students came up with. So these were specifically from group 2 that was looking at surveys and quantitative research. And you can see here, the questions are a variety. So some of them are more open-ended, like advantages and disadvantages of a survey, and some are very pointed, like how does question wording affect the validity of a survey question? So you can see here the students are, I hope, connecting to the material in a different way when they're coming up with the questions themselves, and also providing some helpful foundation for us creating our own discussion board questions, because hopefully they're really aimed at what students are actually getting out of it or what they actually want or need to get out of the material. So some other questions, some quotes from that feedback survey that we have. These are from the open-ended type questions. So you'll see in the first one, they really liked having this is in regards to the ebook, having the text online and some of that functionality that you get out of having an ebook rather than a print, like keyword searching and highlighting. That was appealing for the student. And then again, the second one was really all about the money. I liked not having to spend money on top of tuition. And then I also like this point they made, having different articles rather than one book helps me learn different viewpoints. So hopefully that is a nice plus of creating an OER resource that might pull materials from multiple places. And then here again, a quote that looks at the cost, and then also, okay, yeah, they get expensive. So even though I prefer print, it's nice to have access to the online. And then the last one was a nice look at the variety of the material. So again, not just textbooks, not just journal articles, but we had videos and worksheets from different resources, checklists, and even the city training, which if you had to go through IRB before, you know how long the city training can take, but we ask our students to do that, to look at the ethics of research. It was a nice departure from constant reading, said this student. So it kept them interested as the semester went on, especially when they typically start to lose motivation. So we were glad to hear that the variety of resources was helpful for the student. So in evaluating the project, looking at it over a few semesters, seeing how it's looking in practice, again, it's easy for this on the student side to integrate this OER resource because it's going right into their course. Many of them might not even be aware that it's there, but it's easy to be a part of their learning process. It's part of those weekly modules. Here's what you need to do for the week, and all the material is there. So if we're talking about surveys, we have a tip sheet from this Office of Research and a journal article, and here's a sample one, and here's a video we made. It's all integrated within their learning process. The students also found the materials helpful in helping them achieve those course learning outcomes, especially with the creation of those discussion board questions that help them assess whether they were really learning the material or not. It's always popular to save money. They like not having to pay money for the textbooks. And when we were looking at the final projects of what they were creating for the class themselves, the class itself, the students did a great job at mastering the concept. So perhaps even better than in previous semesters, as evidenced by the final product that they created for the class. Oh, I went too far. Andrew, I think you're going to take over for difficulties.
I'm going to talk about difficulties. One thing I'll just interject here is we are aware that not everything we're describing is pure OER. We understand that. But part of, I think, part of a difficulty is it can be really intimidating to go from, I have a textbook or a couple of textbooks, to my whole course is OER in one semester, bang, it's done. A lot of this takes an awful lot of time. And so looking at incremental steps is a very helpful way to go. We did not have a totally trouble-free experience. So there were difficulties both at the course level and then at the program or university level. The first thing we sort of ran into the problem with was, to what extent are we linking to content rather than hosting that directly? We are librarians, so of course we see things from a slightly different viewpoint, but part of our philosophy is quite often we want students to go to some place. So if we have a journal article, we maybe want them to link, we maybe put in the link to it and off they go. Sometimes we want them to search for it so that they don't just get totally, you know, if it doesn't come up for me automatically, I won't do anything with it. But is this, to what extent do we want to host versus link? Then of course, as soon as you start linking, there are unstable links. There are things that just vanish. There are articles that were on the web yesterday and they are not on the web today. I don't think it was this course, it was another course I was doing something similar in, where in fact I had to go and use the Wayback Machine to try and, because I'm there thinking, did I imagine this? Why do I have a dead link here? I had to use the Wayback Machine to try and find a copy of something that had previously existed online but no longer existed. The other thing is people change URLs. Universities are terrible for this. So as Emily mentioned, we looked at a lot of things in research centers and writing centers. Very often they would have a fabulous resource, and from one week to the next, the URL has changed. I can still go in and find it. And in fact, I did this last week in this very course that I'm teaching this semester, where I had an excellent piece on qualitative research, and it was, the document was still there, it still had the same title, but the URL was 3 letters different. There was an additional level. And so I had to go out and search for it again and correct the link because the students were clicking the link and getting nowhere. The other thing is articles that we have linked within our university databases that suddenly are no longer provided within that database. And of course, that's something over which we have no control. That is also something that's happening more and more because publishers' contracts with database vendors change all the time. And so that's another source of frustration, which you could avoid if we simply downloaded a single copy of something and put it into our course. But wearing our librarian hat, it's a very different thing for the library if Emily and I send our 100 students across our 4 classes, each to download that article, rather than I download it once and mount it into Canvas. There's also, I think, starting to get kind of, slightly dubious about what am I doing? Am I republishing? What's the extent of that? But the library wants the usage statistics because that lets them know how their materials are being used. It's easier for us to download it once and mount it in the course, but that's not going to help the library long term. And so we may lose more stuff because it shows up as not being used. So it gets 1 use in a semester rather than 100 uses in a semester. There are also some difficulties at the university level. The first one obviously is course storage. In fact, we had created for us a specific Canvas shell. It's a perpetual Canvas shell. It's not limited to any one semester. And that's where we created those materials that we then imported into our courses. And technically, that is available to any of our colleagues who are also teaching this, but it's a slightly harder thing since we weren't involved in the original creation of the course. And we would have to sell it to them. Yes, don't forget, we have this resource. These are available to you. And we would then have to request that they got permission to it and so on. The other thing is we do not have a central place where we can publish course content such as this. It's no secret the ESU Institutional Repository is running on a much older piece of software. It is not capable of doing anything other than text documents, and some might argue it's not particularly good at text documents either. But we are hampered by this, and I suspect some of the other players in Kansas are also experiencing these issues, which is one thing that comes out of this whole conference for me is rather than each separate place trying to figure out how does our institutional repository cope with this, how do we disseminate things, are we each getting separate contracts, that looking at a statewide model, and I know Texas is much bigger than we are, but Texas has a statewide OER model where the state is providing the tools for the whole of the educational world, including K-12, to embrace OER and move on. So those are some of the things that are coming up. And next slide, Emily, before I do it. So you can do it. We're sort of the little engine that could. But I think it's important to understand you can start small. You do not need to have to redesign the whole of your course and sit here for the next 6 months, making sure everything is perfect. You can replace one module, start with a single module. Or in our case, look at replacing one textbook. Collaborate, share the work. Emily and I worked on this together because we're teaching the same class. It doesn't make sense for each of us to try to develop our own OER things for our own classes. We collaborate anyway. We already deal with shared course learning outcomes across our curriculum so that everybody who's teaching 810 has agreed on what the course learning outcomes are for every section of our research course 810, so that we're starting with that shared understanding to begin with. So it's easy for us to collaborate, but do look for collaborative opportunities. Recognize the challenges. Course maintenance, it is not once and done. And I think that's really important to understand, especially if you're using a lot of individual materials such as we chose to do. The other thing is, even although I checked all my links at the beginning of the semester before I released the whole course for students, by the time we got to week 4, at least one link had changed and I had to go out and do it. So it's not without requiring constant attention. There is a significant time investment, and we are fortunate now that our promotion and tenure policy recognizes this and is supportive of it. Other people, if you're not being granted an understanding that this is important work and it takes a lot of time and effort, then it probably isn't something you should engage in. And then the format of materials. Are we going to link to things? Are we going to download a PDF? If we do download a PDF, what does that PDF look like? Do we have to make it accessible? How much work is involved in that? Don't ignore the preference for print. Another colleague, Sarah Sutton, and I did some work looking at student preference for print in courses that were providing unlimited use ebooks. And we found over 3 semesters, about 30% of our students were buying the textbook. Another 30% would have preferred print, but chose the electronic version because they didn't want to spend the money. And then there were about another 30% or so who were happy in the native thing. So make sure that there are options to print so that people can print things out so that they can do things with it. And the other thing is, think about accessibility all the way. Build that in. I think we heard that yesterday a couple of times. Build that in from the beginning. Again, like I think it was Tom Mahoney was talking about not trying to go back and caption everything in retrospect, but start building in accessibility from the very creation of your materials. But it's absolutely possible. And I think that's us moving on to questions.
Yes, thank you.
So thanks, Sherry, for the reminder. We're happy to tell you everything we know in the next 10 minutes. Oh, there is a question from a colleague at ESU referring to Rocky and Bullwinkle and Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine. Yes, indeed, that is where the Wayback Machine is, what it's named for, but it is, it's part of the Internet Archive. If you search for Wayback Machine, it will pop up for you. And you can find materials that you knew formerly existed, but it's not infallible. It all depends when the material was there, how long it was there for, and when the automatic harvesting took place. There are some other things that I was trying to find where I could find the front page of something, but I couldn't access any of the subsequent pages because those had not been gathered. When you use a permalink, does that show up as a single use of one for each access? Oh, no, it's even if I take a permalink from so I look up a resource in the library and I grab the permalink, I insert the permalink into the course. Every time that permalink is accessed, it logs one use for the library. So that's a great question. But the permalink itself is just the direct access for the students to the item, but every time it clocks in as a separate usage, which is why the library prefers you to use permalinks rather than download and mount a PDF. How difficult is it to create an OER online course, Emily?
Yeah, I was going to say, I would bet that you, if you've been teaching online, you might have been doing pieces of this already. We're always keeping an eye out for, what's a good article, a recent example that I can share with students, or I need to explain something that really I need to be the one explaining it. So I'm going to create these slides or this short video. So again, like Andrew was saying, I think you can start small. It can be really overwhelming to think I got to completely redo my entire course and make a screen captured video for that's an hour long for every session, and I need, you don't have to choose something so big at the beginning. So you can start small, thinking about areas. If you have multiple texts in your class, maybe think about like we were showing 2 examples of ways that you could go about it. Think about offering an online version through the library, or if it's more of like a workbook, are there other resources I can pull together that are freely available online, or get students to be a part of that process? So I would recommend starting small, because it can be difficult to think about doing it all by yourself and do the whole thing. And so that's why we really, one of the reasons we had titled the talk One Step at a Time is thinking about just starting with small and then building it up to a bigger piece.
The other thing I'll mention here is your subject makes a difference as well.
Sure.
Just when I was thinking, when we were talking to the library about purchasing unlimited use ebooks, to be quite frank, the cost of an unlimited use ebook in library science is running something ludicrous like $120 or $150, where a single print copy may be $60 or $80. Now, in the grand scheme of things, I don't see how people can maintain that model for any length of time. If we're replacing 100 users buying a copy at $60 with a single purchase for 120, it doesn't make any economic sense to me. But for us, we very much have books that are self-contained. We're not using books with a lot of add-on material. So we are not in the same kind of boat as people doing very much undergraduate science, who might have a textbook that comes with test banks, with student study things, with all kinds of things that also require access codes. Obviously, those things are not going to be available as unlimited use ebooks through the library. But if you are in a subject area where you're not sort of tied to those supplemental materials, then an unlimited use ebook, although technically that is not an open educational resource under a strict definition, might be a very reasonable thing for libraries to do. The library has to subscribe to some sort of platform. So you can't just order an unlimited use ebook with nothing in the background. There must be a platform, there must be a vendor providing your system for you. But granted that you have the system, essentially adding that book. The other thing for us is that one book that we added as an unlimited use ebook was $150 for the license, no end in sight. So even although a new edition has come out, we don't automatically get the new edition. That would be a different purchase. But we're looking, and quite often we look and say, is there really a need for us to move to the new edition? We have this one. There's plenty of the old ones available in the secondhand bookstores if you need them. But also it's right there. It's not going away. So we can stick with this. So our $150 purchase that we asked the library to make for us has in fact serviced, what, 200 or 300 students by this time. So it becomes an extremely cost-effective way of supporting student learning. So it's always worth asking. Oh, thank you for the person who appreciates the move to unlimited use ebooks. Is it perfect? No, of course it isn't perfect, but it's a helpful solution to those who can utilize it and find it helpful. Final thoughts, Emily?
I'll just echo what we were saying earlier, that we hope that by showing some different approaches, that there might be ways that you can think about integrating this in your own work, inviting students to be a part of the process, starting out small. Feel free to reach out if you have ideas or thoughts. And
our email addresses are there. If you want to ask us specific questions or you want to borrow our stuff, then absolutely. We did not, a lot of our stuff was reusing materials from elsewhere. So we would not necessarily be involving ourselves in quotes, publishing the course, but we're absolutely happy to share what we've done and how we've done it if you have any other thoughts.
Definitely.
I'm sorry if we've overwhelmed you. That wasn't our intention, but if you do need a little help, or if you want to ask us, here's my situation, how would you start doing this? Please ask us. We're happy to help you. This is something we all need to work on together. And the more we work together, the more progress we will make.
That's a great final statement for us there, Andrew. What a very pleasant and practical presentation that you made for us. Thank you so very much. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks so much, Sherry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.